بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. اللهم افتح علينا بحكمتك وانشر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. يا عليم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا. يا حليم خلقنا بخلق الحلم وحققنا بحقائق العلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I'm very happy to be here, and I extend my thanks to all of the wonderful people who've organized this event, and also I give my greetings to all of the dignitaries that are here. I wish I could call them by their names, but unfortunately I don't know them that well. And I give my greetings to all these wonderful attendees. Many of you appear to be students, and we hope that what we say here will be something meaningful to you. In the pilgrimage goes at the pace of the slowest. And it's very important for us when we speak also that we keep in mind the difficulties that the beginner has in understanding the things that the scholars deal with quite easily and habitually because they've worked with it for years. So I hope that what we say will be meaningful to you. That's the most important thing. We don't want to confuse. We want to be able to diffuse knowledge and to bring it to life bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. One of the things that I'd like to say is that when we look at our tradition, it has so many different aspects. And the aqidah, the fundamental creed that is based on the qat'iyat, that is based on those definitive propositions of belief that are set forth in the Quran and the Sunnah, this is the foundation rock of all Islamic civilization. And it is not metaphysics, which is something else, but it is the foundation of that. And therefore, our scholars always focused on the most fundamental of the fundamentals, getting the beginnings right, and teaching us, first of all, how do we think? What is the epistemology that we use? How do we know what we know? And all of us who go through the works of Aqidah and Kalam, we all study about this, that we have three fundamental types of discursive knowledge. We have revelation, which is the king, and revelation is the arbiter. It is the one that in the end will determine what is actually true and what is false. And that revelation, of course, we have certain standards by which we understand it and we interpret it. And then we talk about aql. We talk about the intellect. And this is perhaps the most important topic that we focus on today. Because Western thought lost its orientation over the last 400 or 500 years. And part of that loss of orientation is that it failed to understand the comprehensive nature of intellect and the ability of intellect to perceive first principles and the truth of those first principles as a means of even understanding revelation and of going forward. And one of the things we know about aql is that the propositions of intellect don't need a laboratory. These are things that we find in our most basic books of Aqidah. And they are so important today, we cannot exaggerate them. That we have intellect, and intellect enables us to say things about reality before we experience reality. We know that the part is lesser than the whole. We know that the greater cannot proceed from the lesser. And we know so many other things as well. Some of them are known immediately, without discussion, and others of them require discussion. We know, for example, that anything that changes must have a beginning. That is an intellectual proof. And it is as sound as 1 + 1 is 2. Of course, today we have to explain that. We have to walk through it. But we know that a world that changes, like this world around us, it must have a beginning. So, talking about intellect, what is intellect? How does it work? Intellect is not a question of probabilities or even of possibilities. It sets these parameters of what is necessary and must be, and what is impossible and cannot be. And then the vast realm of possibilities, or we might say all possibilities, that includes the created world in so many of its aspects. So these beginnings that we might, as students of Aqidah, take for granted, they cannot be taken for granted. We have to understand how absolutely important those discussions are in the context of modernism and postmodernism. They remain among the most important issues of all. And then, of course, we come to experience. And we know that experience is a third source of discursive knowledge, the knowledge that we share in common. But even here, we see how precise our tradition is. The words we choose, or the words that were chosen for us by great scholars, these words are perfectly suited and they fit precisely. So what do we call experience? We call it by different names, but one of the most common is al-'ada. Al-'ada, which would mean customary experience. The experience that you and I share together. And even in that cognitive frame, which is customary experience, we have implied another cognitive frame, which is experience that is not customary. That's extremely important, because the miracles of the prophets, alayhim wassalam, the karamat of the awliya, which we have to believe in as Sunnis, this is a required belief, it's qat'i. We have to believe in the karamat of the awliya and the great companions of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. They had karamat. Just like Sayyidina Umar, may God be pleased with him, when he was leading the conquests of Persia and other places, and one of his armies, as you know, was thousands of miles away from Medina. And he was giving the khutbah in Medina. And then he says, Imam Ali was there in front of him and others, Ya Sariyat al-Jabal. He said, Sariya, the mountain. And the army that was there in Persia, thousands of miles away, they heard him say that. And then they saw that they were being ambushed, and if they put their backs to the mountain, they would be saved, and they were saved. So this is also experience. Moses takes his staff and he throws it on the ground and it becomes a serpent. That's also experience. And there's nothing irrational about it at all. It belongs to the realm of possible being. And the possibilities in the realm of possible being are infinite. It is simply not customary. It is miraculous. So all of these things are very important. And therefore, when we study our tradition, especially in the Aqidah and then in Kalam, when we talk about Kalam, discursive theology, as some people define it, we're of course talking about a great field of knowledge that is rooted in the fundamental Aqidah. It is rooted in the qat'iyat, in those definitive aspects of belief that you and I have to all believe in, if we believe in God and if we believe in His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But then Kalam will grow and grow. And some scholars would say that it has 4 major stages. You have first that initial period of Imam al-Ash'ari, and there's of course also Imam al-Maturidi, and there are people who were just before them and after them. And then you have another period which some would mark perhaps with Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni and his illustrious student Imam al-Ghazali. But one of the things we see about this second period is that it is now articulating itself in terms of internal intellectual developments in the Muslim world. And among the most important of these is the challenge of thinkers like Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina was a brilliant man, one of the most brilliant who ever lived. Our scholars did not deny that. And he makes fundamental mistakes when it comes to theology. But was he totally wrong in psychology, in medicine, even in some of the principles that he articulated? And so therefore we see in the time of Imam al-Ghazali and after that, you see a discourse that is actually not so much rejecting him, although that's often the way that it's presented. And often we present it that way to the common people as well, because you shouldn't read this book. These books are books that are very difficult to read, and one can easily be confused or led astray. But there are also treasures here. And one of the greatest of those treasures was the careful articulation of the paradigm of necessary being, al-wujud al-wajib. Before that, our Kalam tradition is fundamentally concerned with what we can call contingency. And this will be the kind of things you'll find in the early mutakallimin, that this world is contingent. It cannot explain itself. The finite must point to the infinite. We have to establish the existence of one who is a sufficient cause for this world. And therefore we will establish the qidam. We will establish the eternity of God with regard to all past events. Qidam, which explains this world. That is a sound, conclusive, dynamic argument, and it will remain with us to the end of time. But necessary being, which, as you know, in our tradition, we will very soon say, this is the first attribute of God. As-sifatun nafsiyya. It is the ontological attribute. I like to translate it that way. The self-attribute, the attribute that is so closely associated with the self or the essence of a thing that it cannot be separated from that thing. So I like to call that ontological, because we have 8 different traditional arguments for the existence of God. You have the ontological argument, the cosmological argument, the teleological, based on purpose, and design is there, aesthetics is there. And then you have the henological argument, which nobody talks about today. But the henological argument is the argument for the existence of God based on the hierarchies of creation, from simpler to more complex, from mineral to plant to animal, and so forth. It's actually a brilliant argument. And it ties in very much with our understanding of the greatness of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as the greatest of all things that God created. He is the Lord of the prophets and the messengers, and God created nothing under the sun or under the heavens of the earth or under the throne of God that is greater than He. That also is henological argument, which is very beautiful. You have the moral argument. You have the common consensus argument. And you have the great minds argument. And then you have what is called the popular arguments. A lot of us today, we love to prove the existence of God based on the second law of thermodynamics, which is the fact that heat always moves to cold, right? So that if I take hot boiling water and put it in my bathtub, we won't have part of the bathtub which is boiling hot, but soon the whole bathtub will be the same temperature. That's the second law of thermodynamics. And it's said to be, of all the physical laws that we believe in, the most universal. And you can prove from that that this world has a beginning. So we call that the use of the second law of thermodynamics, which I know many of you've read and you've heard, which is a proof of God, but it's a popular argument. And when we say it's a popular argument, we mean it does not have that rigor. And here I'm using the word rigor as intellectual rigor that you have in the ontological argument or the cosmological argument or the teleological or the henological. So it's very important for us, to understand that in our tradition we had great challenges. And those great challenges came sometimes from outside. And this would be the case with the Hellenistic thought. And not just that, but also different types of thought that come from the Hindu tradition or from the Persian tradition or others. And we have to articulate, where do we stand with regard to that? But then you have also developments within the Ummah itself. And here, that concept of necessary being, which it may be before Ibn Sina, some people argue that, but he's the one who really articulates it. Necessary being, possible existence, and those of you who are aware of this debate, you know that there's also the issue of essence and existence. These are extremely powerful cognitive frames. In fact, necessary being in our Ash'ari theology will become perhaps the master paradigm, so that we will see our scholars say that if you understand what is meant by the first attribute, necessary being, everything else will be in order. In fact, they will say that we spell out the negative attributes, which are negations of what God is not. He has no beginning, He has no end. He has no likeness. He has no need. He has no other. The 5 negative attributes. And then we have the 7 fundamental existential or positive attributes: life, knowledge, will, power, hearing, seeing, speech. And these are really profound. And these are the ummahat. They are the foundational attributes of God. And every one of them is extremely important to discuss, not just so that we internalize them and so that we believe in them, but also so that we articulate them today in terms of Western thought. Because you will see that every one of these has a counterpart in the Western worldview. Maybe that word is too big. Or in Western paradigms or cognitive frames that are extremely important. Western thought, modern Western thought, owes very much to the great French thinker Descartes. Descartes. D-E-S, capital C-A-R-T-E-S. And it's very important that when we talk about people like Descartes, there are lots of critiques of Descartes. And maybe the best critiques of him, they come out of the West. Westerners are always thinking, and we have to also pay attention to the critiques they make. But in many ways, Descartes, René Descartes, he begins by defining what is out there in existence. And he has this famous resolution that there are really only two things that is significant to talk about. And that is res extensa, things extended in space. Things. So he defines them as things extended in space. That if I talk about my computer, or I talk about this flower, or I talk about the tree outside, or the bird in the air, I don't have to say anything more than to say that they are extensions in space. It sounds really good, doesn't it? Because it's tight. It boils things down. And then there's another thing we have to talk about, which is res cognitans. That's Latin. He's using the Latin language, which was like the Arabic language for them at that time. So he says you have the cognitive thing, which he will call the mind. You have matter and mind, mind over matter. And all of these are innovations. And they are major departures from the theological tradition of the West, the philosophical tradition of the West, which was largely Aristotelian at that time. And again, in terms of your theology, do you agree? Because when we talk about the negative attributes of God, that he has no beginning, for example, no end, then we're also talking implicitly about the ontological necessities that pertain to these things. That they have beginnings, that they have likenesses, that they have needs, that they have lots of other qualities. So to say that this is just an extension in space, and not to talk about place, or direction, or orientation, or a number of other quantities, I wouldn't accept that. And I think that you might not accept it either. And if you don't accept it, then the whole project is over. The whole project is over, and we have to go back to the drawing board. And here, I want to say a few prefatory remarks and then come back to this. Of course, one of the great things about our tradition is the fact that we want to know who said what. And how did you get it from him or from her? We also have great women scholars. We don't talk about them as much as we should, but we have great women scholars, and it is fard kifaya, a societal obligation to have women scholars just as we have men scholars. But we want to know who said it. Where did you learn this? It's said that every evil in the world goes back to a single heart. Not sure if that's true, but I've heard it from people I trust. That every evil in the world goes back to a single heart. So we've got to be able to trace the ideas back. And this is why also we have to have a science of Occidentalism. Just like in the West, when they wanted to study us, they created the science called Orientalism, which was a misnomer from the beginning as far as we were concerned, because we were never just in the Orient. We were more Western than the Westerners. In fact, the only Islam that ever concerned the Europeans was European Islam. That of Spain, that of Portugal, that of Sicily, and that of other countries as well, like Switzerland. Did you know that Islam was in Switzerland 150 years? In the mountains of Switzerland? Under the Caliphate of Cordoba? That's true. Arnold Toynbee says it is one of the most important facts of the early Middle Ages. Okay, but they have the science of Orientalism, which by its very name is going to make us, who are one of the most important objects of study in that, Orientals. And you're Orientals, God bless you. What a beautiful land is the East, the land of the sunrise. But Islam was never Oriental. It was Occidental, it was Oriental, it was also in the South, it was also in the North. But Occidentalism is not a misnomer. And this is something we really have to study. You have to understand, if you are going to be an Islamic scholar, in my opinion, you've got to understand how did the West get to where they are? And what mistakes did they make, if they made any? And in fact, they made a lot. René Descartes was a great man. He's a genius. Was he an evil man? I don't believe that. He benefited me, in fact, in my own intellectual career, because he established the oneness of God. But the thing is, he makes a big mistake, and we say, Zallatul alim. Zallatul alam. You know, when the scholar trips up, the whole world falls. And so he creates a framework which those of you who have looked into this know a lot about, which is Cartesian dualism. And this is one of the plagues of modernist thought. And it's also one of the reasons for postmodernist deconstruction. Can you get us out of this prison? Even if we look at physics, if you look at quantum theory and its problems that it raises in atomic physics, the main problem here is Cartesian dualism. So we have to also know the Senate. We want to know, where did you get your teaching? But also you have to know, where did they get their teaching? This is very important. Our beloved brother Amran mentioned something extremely controversial, a number of initials, starting with L. And I'm not going to mention them again. But again, that whole issue of gender, the issue of marriage, and so forth, where does it come from? It just dropped out of the sky? No. It has a Senate. It goes back to individual hearts. And so also for us to talk about it intelligently, we must be really careful. We can't just get up and shout that this is insane. We don't believe this. This is also one of the signs of the Dajjal. In the times of the Dajjal, women won't need men and men won't need women. And they will marry each other. The Prophet told us that, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, so we can get up and talk about it and we can get all furious about it. But the intelligent way is, where did you get these ideas? Because you didn't make them up. And they didn't just fall from heaven. And no doubt their context is complex. We have to look at the food we eat, the environment we live in, and many other things. But the chain of transmission here, at least one of them, is Karl Marx. Postmodernism goes back to him also. Postmodernism is a very Marxist, neo-Marxist ideology. So you go back to Karl Marx, and from Karl Marx you come to Sigmund Freud. And from Sigmund Freud you take a very dark turn, if he wasn't dark enough. Reductionist psychology. This is a very important word for us to emphasize, the reductionism of modernist thought and postmodernist thought. But then you go to Wilhelm Reich. Wilhelm, which is German for William, W-I-L-H-E-L-M. Wilhelm Reich, R-E-I-C-H. This man is the one who coins sexual revolution. And he's not talking about having a good time. He's saying that we cannot have freedom in a classless society if we don't overthrow the rule of heterosexuality. And if we don't overthrow taboos like incest. You should look at what he's saying, because these are, and then you go from that to Herbert Marcuse, Marcuse, and then maybe we can end the Senate today with Judith Butler, who, you know, she's one of the most important voices in all of this. So when we talk about ideas, we've got to talk about people. We've got to talk about specific people. And we have to take the ideas back to where they come from. And in this regard also, let's take another example which is perhaps more pleasant than that one. But in the 18th century, there was a great thinker, Englishman, whose name was Joseph Priestley. I respect him very much. Joseph Priestley. You probably know him as one of the fathers of modern chemistry. And he was a great chemist, and he also was a theologian. He was a Unitarian theologian. Very interesting. His theology is not in any way identical to ours. We have some major differences with him, but he was a Unitarian. And in many things that pertain to the unity of God in particular, we are very close. But Priestley was what was called at that time a dissenter. And dissenters were those Protestants who were not, in England, Anglican. They didn't follow the Church of England. They were of other persuasions. Baptists, Anabaptists, Arians, you had Arians and others. And the dissenter in England at that time did not have equal rights with the Anglican Protestant. He or she was excluded from a great deal of opportunities. There was sort of an institutional bias against them. So the dissenter couldn't go to the great schools like Oxford or Cambridge or, you know, some of the other secondary schools. Yeah, they couldn't do that. They were out. So Priestley said that if we cannot go to their schools, then we will make our own schools. And our schools will be better. We need to be able to think like this also, and we need to be able to act like this. And Priestley creates an educational system which is vastly superior to what was existing at that time. He introduces the study of modern languages, along with ancient languages, Latin and Greek. He knew Arabic, he knew Hebrew, he knew Aramaic, Greek and Latin, French and Italian, Anglo-Saxon. He was a scientist, a theologian, one of the great minds of modern history. But Priestley, who was fundamentally concerned with science, he is, after all, a father of modern chemistry. He said, we must never teach science without teaching the history of science. That means you've got to study the scientists themselves. Don't just look at the latest theory, but where did these theories come from? What are the human hearts that they come out of? And I want to say we have to do this too, brothers and sisters. We have to study the history of thought, especially the history of medieval thought, in Europe, in Occidentalism, in our own civilization as well, but also the history of thought as we go into the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. This is a big job. But you will see, I believe, that this job will do a lot of work for you. And it will enable you to understand what is going on, instead of just taking things as they are and trying to sort it out. And, let's take just another point. For example, in Darwinian evolution, or evolutionism, one of the most important things to study when we talk about Darwin is to study the biologists who were his contemporaries or who were before him. Because you will see that the biggest criticism of Darwin didn't come from the church. That's propaganda. Yes, it's true. The church did not like what they understood Darwin to be saying. But the main criticism that came to him was a scientific criticism based on 19th century biology and taxonomy, which studies the classification of animals and other things. And let's take one example. One of the greatest biologists of the late 18th century, late 18th, 1700s, early 19th century, is a French biologist whose name is Georges Cuvier. Georges is the French for George, except they put an S at the end of it that they don't pronounce. And then his name is Cuvier, which is Cuvier. This man is worth your studying. He is one of the fathers of modern biology, modern zoology, taxonomy, paleontology. He put together the dinosaurs, the ancient fishes. He talked about species of animals that existed and don't exist anymore. And he believed in evolution. And most of the 19th century biologists believed in evolution. But they knew that it was an act of God. That's the important thing. That it could not be by chance. And also that it could not be without design and without purpose. And they had other approaches to it, which I won't take time to go into, which are metaphysical, of the highest order, something that would appeal to us. But one of the things Cuvier showed is that all organic creatures are perfectly symmetrical in themselves, so that everything in them, every detail, relates to every other detail. And he would say, and he was an anatomist. He worked with anatomy, bones. He would say, give me the bone of any animal, one bone, a femur, maybe a digit of the finger, and I can put the whole animal together. And to this day, our museums that are building dinosaurs or other mammals of the past, they're using these techniques because every bone has got to match with every other bone. So he said, just give me one bone. Of course, he's a brilliant man and he's got lots of experience. But he said, I can put that animal back together and I can tell you whether it was a carnivore, an omnivore that eats everything, or a herbivore that just eats plants. And therefore, when change happens in animals, it must happen all at once. The animal must be completely restructured. You cannot have partial changes, that the eye just begins to change a little bit. No, you'll be blind. You won't be able to see. And this was one of the foundations of his critique of an evolutionary theory. This is before Darwin, by the way. But there were theories like this. Lamarck was the proponent of that, who were saying this is just natural law and chance. He said that cannot be. And natural law, also, this is something you have to study about. What are natural laws? They're not laws. That's a misnomer. They are psychological habits. They are generalizations about experience. They cannot cause anything. And Western thought is all you need there. The critique of natural law in modern Western philosophy of science is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. So we have to look at these things. And here I'd like to conclude, and I hope that this will be meaningful to you and adequate for you. But here I'd like to conclude by going back to the issue of first principle. First principles. Where do we begin? How do we know what we know? Where is the solid ground? And it's true, modernist thought in the West, in science and in other areas, is rigorous. It's true. They're serious. They work very hard. But they never start at the right point. All of their sciences are filled with fundamental, principial mistakes, often that translate themselves into reductionism. How can I study psychology if the psyche is all I study? That's reductionism. Psychology is very important. But if I want to understand the psyche, don't I have to understand other things as well? What kind of a world is out there? And you know, one of the things modernist thought will do in the 1700s in particular is to denude the natural world. So there are no spirits, there are no demons, there's no witchcraft, there's nothing like that. And it will rationalize the world. That is reductionism. That is reductionism. It is to exclude from the picture elements that have to be there, which are actually there. Are there such things as demons? We have to believe in them. That's aqidah. It's qat'i. In Chicago, I have a friend who works in emergency medicine, and he works in one of the very poor and dangerous parts of the city. We have gangs and you have murders, and every weekend you've got probably 70 attempted homicides. 70. That's really bad news, isn't it? It's not good. But one day a little boy was brought to him. And this boy's maybe 12 years old. And he can't make eye contact. And he can't talk. And his mother's saying somebody hypnotized him. Okay, and so my friend is looking at him and he said, he looks possessed. And one of the nurses said, would you like me to go get a crucifix? I mean, she's mocking that. Like, aren't you a doctor? And then they bring in the psychologist and the neurologist. They look at him for 5 minutes. He's schizophrenic. They write that down. So now he will be treated with powerful schizophrenic drugs, maybe for the rest of his life. If he wasn't a schizophrenic, he probably will be one now. And the thing is that there are such things as demons, although most of our people would say this is sexual abuse. That's probably what it is. And we don't have to talk about that in more detail. But this boy was almost certainly abused. And that's why he's in this state. But also that opens up a door for demonic possession as well. So one doesn't exclude the other. But we have to always go back to the beginnings. That what are your first principles? And here we can look at a statement by Aristotle. And again, you know, I believe that we have to honor people like Aristotle and Plato. Do we accept categorically everything that our Falsafa tradition hands down to us in the name of Aristotle or Plato? No, we don't do that. We will take some, we will leave others. But Aristotle was a great thinker. In my belief, he's not as great as Plato. Plato was also a great thinker. One of the things that Aristotle says, though, is that if you make a mistake at the level of first principles, you will have a catastrophe at the level of detail. If you make a mistake at the point of first principles, you will have a catastrophe at the level of detail. You'll have a train wreck. And this is why we in our tradition are always concerned with the beginnings. Whatever science we talk about, Where do we begin? Where is the foundation? What are the guiding principles of that? And this is civilization. And this is knowledge. And one of the greatest accomplishments of our civilization, in my belief, is that we rooted knowledge. This took us 300 to 400 years. One of the first people who's famous for this is Jabir ibn Hayyan, who lived in the days of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq and Imam Malik. God be pleased with them all. But Jabir, who is a chemist, he is also a rooter of knowledge. Some people say he's the one who begins it. I don't know enough to say. But what we understood is that all this knowledge that we're inheriting from antiquity, from late antiquity, chemistry, physics, veterinary medicine, biology, zoology, agriculture, water, hydrology, embryology. We knew all about embryos from a very early time. That all of this knowledge should make sense. We should be able to bring it all together. It should be coherent. And we, I believe, did a very credible job of accomplishing that. And this is, again, finding the first principles that these sciences have together. So this is very important. Al-bidayatu majallatu nihayat. This is something that Ibn Ata'Allah as-Sakandari says in the beginning of his munajat, which are beautiful of his rasail. He says this in the beginning of his letters. He says, Al-bidayatu majallatu nihayat. The beginnings are the manifestations of the ends. You want to have a good beginning. You want to get started in the right way every day. Get your beginnings right, bi'iznillahi ta'ala. And where we begin is ironically where we end. It's very hard to understand that, isn't it? But where we begin is where we end. If I begin with knowledge, first principles, fundamental truth, and that's what basic aqeedah is. It's just the fundamentals of what reality is, how it works. And it is a huge accomplishment. And is it all the knowledge of God? Is it metaphysics? No, it's not. It is the foundation. But it is adequate. And this is a very important word for us. It is adequate, meaning it is sound. It is a roadmap that you can depend on. We will never throw it away. We will never contradict it. And on that basis, we will build a civilization. So, you've got to get the principles right. You've got to get the beginning right. And here, when we look at our own sciences, it's kind of easy to do this because in the traditional Islamic world, we will always begin with principles. We have even al-mabadi al-ashara. We have the 10 fundamental guidelines by which we say, what is the name of this science? Who founded this science? What does it do? Where does it come from? What is hukm shar'i fi? What does the law say about it? Is it a societal obligation? Is it a personal obligation? And so forth. This is brilliant. We are a civilization of definition, of definitions. And we live today in a world of the reign of plastic words. Do you know what a plastic word is? We use them all the time. Nature. Nature is a plastic word. It's got so many connotations, hundreds, and no denotation. What is nature? Nature is a standby for God. It's a way we can talk about God without mentioning His name. So, does nature have a beginning? Does nature have an end? Is nature alive? Is it not alive? Does it dictate terms? What is nature? It's just a big X. I can't talk about chance because nobody would believe me, but I can talk about nature. So these are plastic words. And in Islamic civilization, there's really no room for plastic words. We want to know what is the definition of time. What is the definition of space? What is the definition of this or that and the other? And sometimes we'll have different definitions. That's okay. But this is mustalah. It's a term that we agree on. We make peace that when I say the word time, I'm talking about the same thing you're talking about. So the beginnings are very important. And then also when we look at the thought of other people and other civilizations, we've got to go back to the beginning. And that's why René Descartes, this is a great man. Immanuel Kant is a great man. But Immanuel Kant will make absolutely, categorically huge mistakes. His whole concept of phenomena and noumena is absurd. And Westerners pointed that out. Whitehead pointed that out. That unless you can demark that noumena, you can't have a border. That's logic. So we have to pay a lot of attention to where they started and the assumptions they made. Because a lot of modern science is assumptions. And assumptions are not the same as principles. What's an assumption of modern science? The uniformity of nature. Is nature uniform? God never does the same thing twice. God recreates the creation in every moment. And of course there is continuity. There is beauty. But is nature uniform? Not necessarily. So how can you make that assumption? How can you make that assumption? And, so we have to be honest about that. What about the Copernican principle, which says that matter is evenly distributed in space? That's called the Copernican principle, and Copernicus is not guilty of that. They named it after him. But how do you know that matter is evenly distributed in space? You don't know. You don't know. This is an assumption, and it is an assumption which is necessary to do the mathematics. And like maybe I can say, but I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept your mathematics. Not unless you can give me a metaphysical principle that establishes that matter is evenly distributed. We also have the idea of closed system universe. This is one of the foundations of modern astrophysics. Closed system universe. What does it mean? It means there is just so much energy out there. There is just so much matter out there. It never increases, it never decreases. It goes back and forth. Whoever proved that? No one. That is an assumption. And it is an assumption necessary to the undertaking of modern secular astrophysics. So these things are very important, and one person that you might want to read on that, there's one book that I like from my country by Richard Weaver. It's called Ideas Have Consequences. And Richard Weaver, he's from the University of Chicago. I also come from there. I think Richard Weaver is a very important critique of modern thought. And one of the things he's going to say is that we've got to have metaphysics. You can't just have a horizontal view of the world where you try to explain things in terms of other things. Okay, you've got to have the vertical connection. You've got to bring in the divine. Okay, and then there's also a great physicist and mathematician, who's a Catholic. He is a Thomist, meaning he follows the thought of Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas was a great thinker. He deeply influenced by us, by Averroes, by Ibn Sina, and by Al-Ghazali, and by others. Aquinas says, numerus stat ex materiae, Latin. He wrote in Latin. He said, numerus, number, stat, stands, ex, outside of materiae. Number stands outside of matter. 4 words. Do they sound beautiful to you? They intoxicate me. Because that single sentence overthrows Descartes, overthrows Kant, and overthrows all kinds of other nonsense which will occur in 18th century, 19th century, and 20th century thought. The reign of quantity. that there's nothing out there. If things are extensions in space, then they're just quantities. Then you can do quantitative physics. That's what Descartes wanted to do. And he's not an evil man, but he wants to have quantitative physics, which is nothing but measurement and mathematics. Is there anything wrong with that? Not necessarily, if you remember that you did it. And for this reason also, if you look at a man that I like, his name is Wolfgang Smith. Wolfgang Smith. And he has the Quantum Enigma. He has a brilliant refutation of Stephen Hawking. He's not easy to read, and he will make assertions which I think are very important. I can't say if everything he says is correct. He's way up above me. I'm not a physicist. But he is. And again, one of the things that Wolfgang Smith says is that if you don't have metaphysics, you don't have physics. If you're going to have real physics, real astrophysics, you've got to have metaphysics. And then he will say that because of that, modern science, which is a huge accomplishment, none of us would be so foolish as to deny that. And none of us, I think, can fail to admire the great men and women of science. I've studied a lot about them, and they are amazing human beings. They devoted themselves to their sciences with rigor, with great rigor. But one of these things he says is that if science does not have metaphysics, it has no ability to talk about ontology, the nature of being. So he says, therefore, when science comes to tell us about what is and what is not, we have to understand that it is not standing on solid ground. And look at quantum theory. Big Bang, which is a big deal, but Big Bang may not last very long, because from the time that Big Bang was articulated a few decades ago, it has had huge internal contradictions. So these are things that we have to pay a lot of attention to. But he says modern science is on ground that we can evaluate and measure. Maybe we could say solid ground. When it talks about application. Okay, here's my computer. I would be lost without my computer. It makes me sound like I have an education. If I don't have my computer, I'm in trouble. I'm like the scholar that he loses his book in the rivers, and that's the end of his academic career. Okay, so we have this microphone. It enables me to speak to people in the back of the room. I came here on an airplane. Otherwise, if I had come here by ship, I'd still be on the boat. So, we appreciate the great accomplishments of modern science. But we have to understand that there's a fundamental difference between the quality of its applications and the quality of its ontological statements. That's where it's on very weak ground. And let me conclude now. And in conclusion, and again, I hope that you can follow what I'm saying. I know the scholars can do much better than that. And scholars know these things inside out. Some of you are beginners. What is a beginner in our tradition? A mubtadi. The beginner is the person who cannot articulate an argument and does not know the proofs. That's the way that we define the beginner, at least in the traditions I'm familiar with. The beginner is the one who cannot articulate an argument and they don't know the proofs. The beginner can't really ask profound questions. He or she will be able to do that once they have ceased to be just beginners. Then they will have profound questions. But the beginner is in a state of just listen and learn. But so I hope that that everything we say here is something that you can grasp and benefit from, bi'ithnillahi ta'ala. In any case, paradigms and cognitive frames. Paradigms and cognitive frames. This is the way we think. We think in terms of paradigms, which are overarching concepts, like closed system universe. That's a paradigm. Uniformity of nature, that's a paradigm. Is it correct? I'm going to say no, categorically no. I would say, let's go back to the drawing board. Wouldn't that be nice? Let's start over again. And in any case, I'm not going to accept that. I don't believe in that. And then anything based on it is going to be weak because, again, as we say in our tradition, and we get this also from the Greeks, that no argument can be stronger than its weakest proof. No argument can be stronger than its weakest proof. So if I've got something weak in my argument, like the assumption of the uniformity of nature, or closed system universe, or the Copernican principle, then my argument cannot be stronger than that. Sir Arthur Eddington, who is one of the great thinkers of the 20th century, he said, talking about modern physics, quantum theory, and also astrophysics, he said, physics has become a mystic's chant in front of an unintelligible universe. Okay, this is a man who's serious about science. But he's saying, what are we doing? Stephen Hawking, this is a mystic's chant in front of an unintelligible universe. It is nonsense, brothers and sisters. And if you don't believe that, you look at the way that Wolfgang Smith takes it apart. And it is not rigorous in any way. Okay? But Eddington will also say it is very disconcerting that every time we have a new discovery, we have a new theory. Okay, so what does that mean? It means you don't have a theory. That's what it means. It means you didn't begin in the right place, because if you did, you won't have to have a new theory every time you discover something. These are all methodological, epistemological issues of the greatest order. You've got to pay attention to paradigms and cognitive frames, and that's exactly what we do. When we begin our aqidah, what are our paradigms of thought? What are our cognitive frames? Qidam, that's a cognitive frame. Huduth, temporality, the existence of something after not existing. That is powerful. And that is a cognitive frame that is solid gold. It will remain that way until the day of judgment. So pay attention to cognitive frames. And I have to say that also because you can be entrapped by cognitive frames. You can be entrapped by cognitive frames. And that's why, as one of our great speakers said, we don't want you to just be, Sidi Suhail, we don't want to just be in the work of refutation, that we're going to defeat everything out there. You've got to give a vision. You've got to give a vision. And when everything I've got to say is a refutation of somebody else, I'm preserving their argument. Not only that, but I am in the shade of their argument. Maybe I can't escape from it. And this is why in the world of cognitive frames and paradigms, you've got to set your own. There's a good book here too that you can read, and this is an easy book and a funny book. And it's by an author called George Lakoff. George Lakoff, Lakoff. And it's called Don't Think of an Elephant. So what are you thinking of right now? Malaysian elephant. African elephant, right? Pink elephant. Okay, don't think of an elephant. And this is about cognitive frames. And especially he wrote it as an American citizen for the benefit of my country, which is that, and he wrote this, after the Bush election, after the 2000 Bush election. But he said the right wing in my country has been spending billions of dollars now for almost half a century resetting paradigms and cognitive frames. And this is the political discourse they use. And if you use their cognitive frames, you will be entrapped by them. You will not be able to defeat them in argument or in politics. And if we look at the last election in my country, you see this in a very unfortunate way. that this man is playing into the cognitive frames. That's all he's doing. He doesn't even have to explain them, and we will be entrapped in that. So this is very important, because as we talk about postmodernism, which is extremely important, and modernism, which still remains very important. Modernism is a special ideology. We must know the nature of it. And postmodernism is a triumphalist boast that modernism is over. No, it's not. Many people say modernism is still alive and functioning. But when we talk about modernism and postmodernism and other ideas, it's very important to have your vision, to have your view. Otherwise, you will be entrapped in their cognitive frames. If we're just refuting them point by point, it's very likely we will never win. We will never win. And here, I want to end with a metaphor from Alexander the Great. And all of you know about this amazing man. And he wanted to conquer Asia, which in those days, of course, was the Persian Empire. And then he wanted to go beyond that. But there was a king in the kingdom of Gordium. And his name was, what? Gordius. And he prophesied, can we use that word? I mean, he wasn't a prophet, but he foretold that no one could conquer the east from the west until they unraveled the Gordian knot. And the Gordian knot was this huge mess of rope and twine tied together one way and another. And he said, if you can unravel this, you can conquer the east. And when Alexander the Great came to Gordium and he saw the Gordian knot, what did he do? He cut it in two. He said, I unraveled the Gordian knot. And so we use this expression to cut the Gordian knot. We use it for when we have extremely difficult and involved problems, and we look for a direct, often forceful way of solving that problem. And again, I don't want to be misunderstood, and I'm afraid of being misunderstood, especially in the age of Twitter. Tweet, 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 tweet. One person told me, forgive me, Twitter is for twits. It's not for twits, you know, it's for great people as well. And this is another thing we have to understand, that in the age of the media that we have today, the media affects the message profoundly. But if you want to communicate and you want to influence, you've got to use every single form of the media. From Facebook to Twitter to YouTube to books to newspapers to speeches. And you know, this is something well understood by media people, I believe. This is one, so I can ask him if he agrees. But you know, we have to use the media, but and so we have to be very careful, because a lot of our media today, it simplifies things to no end. And one of our great scholars in the West, perhaps you can bring him here, he was in our conference that we had years ago in Dubai, Dr. Sherman Jackson, Abdul Hakim Jackson. He's a brilliant man. But he told me recently when I visited him in California, he said social media, which some people have rightly called anti-social media, will leave us no leaders at all. And it will leave us no values or principles. And of course, backbiting and slander are things that the Prophet ﷺ warned us about. We have to be careful. You know, the social media becomes one of the most powerful weapons of backbiting and slander that human beings have ever seen. And it will leave us no leader. It will leave us no value whatsoever. But at the same time, I would like to suggest that your new vision is what counts. Let's say our new vision. And that's like cutting the Gordian knot. That yes, we have to study these ideas. We have to have Occidentalism. It has to be profound. But as was said, we've got to put forward something that is new and fresh. And it's got to come out of our tradition. And it's got to articulate itself with regard to the big questions that have been raised in this age. And let me conclude with that by saying just another word. I'm taking too much time. But, you know, you live in an amazing age. And we have a lot to do in this age. If we study the history of religion, and one of the best places to study that is the great English historian and philosopher of history, Arnold Toynbee. He is very concerned about religion and very concerned about the history of religion. But human beings are religious by their natures. This is inescapable. If you try to take away from them religion, and this we saw very clearly in the 20th century, the Soviet Union, Maoist China, Nazi Germany, secularism was everywhere. When you take away from them religion, they will adopt secular alternatives to religion. Secular alternatives to religion. The human being is fundamentally religious. Either you give him or her a real religion that will liberate them and make them human, or they will make up their own make-believe. And in the world you live in today, you have a new religious movement born every 12 hours. 2 new religious movements born every single 24 hours, every single day. And what does that mean? Well, of course, it reflects the crisis of globalism, monoculture, the death of religion, many other things. But also it reflects that people are starving. People are thirsty. They've got to have something in which they can believe. And that thing in which they can believe, it could either be very destructive, what some people call identity religion, me against the world, narcissistic religion. I am what counts. A lot of these movements are narcissistic. And I have got it right, everybody else has got it wrong. And those can be very violent. Extremism in its different forms. You have Christian extremists, right-wing extremists, you have Muslims who are extremists, you have Jews, you have Hindus, you have Buddhists, and others. We're not the only one who have that plague. But extremism is identity religion, that I count and nothing else does. I count and my group counts, nothing else does. So that's one approach, just damn the world. But that won't work for humanity at all. It's very destructive, it's very harmful, very dangerous. But the vast majority of human beings, they have to know, why are we here all together? Why so many races? Why so many traditions? Why so many languages? Why so many countries and climates? And always when you bring the human family together, when they've been separated for a long time, you will have profound religious crisis. And this is one of the generating historical factors behind the history of Hinduism, Buddhism, Neoplatonism, Christianity as it develops under the Roman Empire, Mithraism, and so forth. This is very important, and this is so important for us because today the world is together as it has never been before. We all can look at each other on the internet, we can read each other's newspapers, we can learn about different places, and so therefore Toynbee was very correct in saying that the world will be in major religious crisis. It's got to have a religion that can make sense for it in the 21st century. And Toynbee also was quite frank that Islam could do that. Islam has got everything it needs for that. We came into the modern age with our spiritual apparatus intact. We still pray the way that we used to pray. the way the Prophet prayed, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We still make pilgrimage, we still fast, we still do other things very much the way he did. So our spiritual apparatus is intact. That's a big thing. Maybe we're the only religious community who can really say that about themselves. And I don't want to be triumphalist. May God protect us from that, as our dear brother said. We don't want to be triumphalist about anything. We're not doing hardly anything. But we've got to begin to work. But Toynbee said, and don't laugh, because it's not a joke, the problem's not in Islam, the problem's in the Muslims. And it makes us smile. Maybe we want to laugh, but we shouldn't. Because what he's saying is that the post-colonial Muslim, which is the one he's thinking of in post-World War II, he or she has been so crushed and pulverized by the experience of colonialism, the loss of their tradition, the loss of their position in history. They don't have self-esteem, and often they don't have even the most basic understanding. So they won't be able to do it. It's like saying their tradition could do it, but they can't relate to their tradition. And this is where I think that the phenomenon that we see here among you before my eyes, this beautiful phenomenon of so many young people, men and women interested in these things. This is a great thing because you can do it. You are not that post-colonial person who has been broken. You're a new generation. And also, in a global world, we have to work together. We have to be global. So maybe someone like you're going to have tomorrow, my beloved Sidi Abdul Hakim Murad, one of the most intelligent people I know on earth, quite frankly. And you know him. This man is a giant. He is a giant. We've got people like that. We've got people also like others that I could mention that you might not know at Oxford and elsewhere. These are great people. And you are great people. And working together, we can find that synergy, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, that enables us to put the vision together. That's what you've got to do. Like, what is the vision of Islam today that answers all our questions, that meets all of our needs, that gives us a way forward? And that will be one of the greatest services to humanity. And may we be among the people who begin to do that and to continue to do that and take it really seriously. May it be an act of love. When you love something, you attach to it. When you attach to something, you're ready to serve it day and night. When you serve it, you become connected to the others who serve it, and you become connected to your Lord as well. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. اللهم اغفر لنا وارحمنا وتجاوز عن سيئاتنا ووفقنا فيما نحن فيه والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.